Hi everyone, Seth Singleton here. No Bruno today. I think he's pretty much going to be a bit of a temperamental co-host or co-introducer. He hasn't really agreed to a title yet either. Temperament being part of the issue. However, by myself here, happy to take a moment to look back to a great conversation I had with Matt B. Lloyd during Will Eisner Week. There was a lot going on that week. And if you got the chance to hear the John Hitchcock conversation that I had with the owner of Parts Unknown Comic Shop and all he had to share about his interactions and experiences with Will Eisner, you might have seen a glimpse of Matt B. Lloyd in those still shots that I was able to share with that video. Well, around the same time, Matt was gracious enough to sit down with me and talk about one of Will Eisner's amazing works, his perhaps most seminal project. I'm talking about A Contract with God. And I was lucky enough to talk with someone who is so knowledgeable about the earliest days of what is called the golden age of comics. And he shared some great insights about his interactions with Will Eisner's work and also his thoughts as we went through this really amazing book. This is the video portion of that I'm thankful and happy to share with you. And I encourage you, if you enjoy hearing Matt's insights, you can also catch him hosting classic comics on the Comics in Motion podcast network and also writing great reviews for DC Comics News. Here now, my great conversation with Matt B. Lloyd and our topic, Will Eisner's A Contract with God. Enjoy. Case. Hello and welcome to another episode of Storytelling with Seth. I'm your host, Seth Singleton, and it is my genuine pleasure and delight to have with me today Mr. Matthew B. Lloyd from DC Comics News. Matt, how are you, sir?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you for having me. I'm feeling
It's my
good.
genuine, it's my genuine pleasure. I do want to point out the fact that you will also, if you listen to podcasts and if you've listened at all to Comics in Motion, you'll be aware that Matthew B. Lloyd has recently launched his own podcast show on Comics in Motion. Matt, can you tell us a little bit about that so people have an idea about your background?
Yeah, that is a show called Classic Comics with Matthew B. Lloyd, and what I do is I cover material that is pre-Silver Age. There's no company alignment or anything like that. There's no particular genre of books or characters, but I just cover stuff pre-Silver Age. So I've done stuff on newspaper ships like Terry and the Pirates, um, old comics like the original Daredevil that was published by Lev Gleason, something that a lot of people may not have heard of. And then my show that just came out this week is about the Human Torch and the Submariner and their first meeting in 1940 in Marvel Mystery Comics and their battle and whatever. But I talk a lot and have a spider web kind of mind, so I tend to go on in different directions with things as well. Even though I have a purpose, that actually ends up talking about the Marvel Captain Marvel movie also because I found a connection in my brain and it went right to it as part of it. So lots of stuff like that. I like to. I've always enjoyed old comics, especially stuff from the 40s, especially stuff from newspaper strips. I don't know why. There's something different about them. To me, they're much more sophisticated and uh, grown up than a lot of the basic comics we think of when we go back to the golden age. And sure, I enjoy picking up a DC Archives book from the golden age and reading the original stories of Superman, Batman, Green Lantern, all that stuff. But you go to the newspaper strips and there's just a maturity to a lot of that stuff that's well beyond the basic comics. And I think we'll get into that with talking about Will Eisner and not just A Contract with God, but his spirit stuff and really anything he did. He was a real innovator, and that's how that connects. And that's why I just thought of that.
Well, it's one of the reasons why I was so excited to contact you and ask you to come on for this episode. This episode, as you've alluded to, is going to focus on Will Eisner. Last year, I had the chance to sit down with Danny Fingeroth, who is a Marvel writer and is currently the chair of the Will Eisner organization, and
Oh
he
wow.
chairs the Will Eisner Week. Yeah, He was so great. He recently wrote a book about Stan Lee and his experiences and stories that he learned while working with Stan Lee. And then later, he and Stan did a lot of projects together in collaboration with Will Eisner and Will Eisner Week. So
Oh,
it was often that they got to hang out. He had some great stories, and he also just sort of gave me a reference point for Will Eisner. And I always understood his value because he was so often referenced in regards to one of the earliest pioneers and figureheads of comics. And then all it takes is once a year paying attention to when the big awards come around. And the biggest in comics is the Eisner Award. And all you have to do is read a little bit about this guy to uncover what an amazing person he was. Which brings me to what I think is a great way for folks to sort of get an idea of how people discover him, which is to ask Matt, how did you first become aware of Will Eisner? What was your exposure to him and interest, and sort of let people know how you knew this guy we're both going to be talking about?
it is interesting that I know exactly how I first discovered Will Eisner. I remember specific details. I was in the comic book shop that day. Heroes aren't hard to find in Charlotte. I was 13 years old. I think that was seventh grade. It was spring. I think it was spring of seventh grade. I was 13 years old, and I was in the comic shop one day. And back then there were regular comic racks and stuff, but then there was another section that had magazines. Like, I don't think heavy metal was on that rack, but they had more magazines like that had comics and stuff in them. And there was this magazine that said Will Eisner's The Spirit magazine, and I really didn't know what it was, but I think it was CC Beck. It said interview with CC Beck, who of course is one of the co-creators of the original Captain Marvel from Fawcett Comics. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what that's all about. So I picked it up and sort of flipped through it, and it had 4 black and white Spirit stories. It had a one color Spirit story reprinted in the center, and then it had the interview with CC Beck, and it was actually Will Eisner interviewing CC Beck. And I thought, this is interesting. This is different. And I really liked the cover. The cover was the Spirit hanging from a tree with his legs wrapped around this, thug looking guy. And he was obviously, the guy was so big, the Spirit had to try to get him with his legs just to try to stop him. If he was standing in front of him, the guy would have just steamrolled him. But that was interesting. And then the image, the stuff I saw inside, and I wanted to read about the CC Beck interview. And so I bought that with my comics. And I went home and I read it, and I probably read it 3 or 4 times, really. I even took it to school the next day. It was that I'm taking this with me. So it was shoved inside my notebook. We had a little pocket in the front of the 3-ring binders, and it was shoved in there. And I was showing a friend at school, look at this I got, look at the art, da 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 da. And that was my first introduction to Will Eisner and the Spirit. So unfortunately, that was the very last issue of the Spirit magazine, because in the back of it, there was an ad coming a couple months down the road. They started reprinting all the post-war Spirits in a regular comic book. And so I started getting that immediately when that came out a couple months later. And there was also an ad for Steve Canyon magazine, which was going to be a reprint of all of Milton Caniff's Steve Canyon newspaper strips from its inception in 1947. And I thought, well, I just looking at it, it was like, this looks different. This looks interesting. And I really like the bigger magazine format too. So I started buying that, but Milton Caniff is a different subject who I have a lot of love for also. But anyways, that is my specific memory of my introduction to Will Eisner in the Spirit. So I started getting, Shelton had a couple other older issues still on the rack that I was able to pick up. And then he had some ones that were a little bit older in the back. I found one with, I wanted to get the one with the interview with Jack Kirby. And so I was going to buy it, and because I was only 13 or 14, Shelton was like, my mom was there, told my mom, I like, some of the stuff was a little bit adult, and there was like some nudity in the original stuff that Eisner had in there. He was also serializing a life force at the time in that one of his graphic novels from the 80s. And there was some nudity in there. And so my mom was like, no, you can't have that. I was like, but I really honestly said, but I want it for the interview with Jack Kirby. And they're like, no. I bought it a couple years later when I was older.
That's like saying, "Oh, I only buy the Playboys for the fiction inside." Right? That's the only and the jokes.
It was really funny because I didn't even know that was going to be in there. I really wanted it for the interview with Jack Kirby.
Sure.
So I started getting that and reading all the comics that were coming out with the Spirit reprints, and eventually I got to ordering more back issues from the publisher directly. They still had back issues that I couldn't find in the store of that, and that's when I first started getting some of the graphic novels. Of course, I got to read most of the Life Force as it was serialized in the Will Eisner magazine, Spirit magazine, that where it first was published, and then some of the older issues had a Signal from Space, which is called A Life on Another Planet, and then it's a Signal from Space once it's collected. And I read some of those, and then I got that book, and that's when I got A Contract with God. Because then at this point, of course, I'd read about A Contract with God, I'd heard about it. It's the first graphic novel, that kind of thing. And it's like I gotta get more of this because this guy's great, and all this Spirit stuff is great, and it's so different, and I got to get this. And that's how I first found Will Eisner and the Spirit, for that matter.
Well, that's a really fortuitous discovery. You find the last issue that's being printed. You're able to get one or two of the previous, and then it turns you immediately on to the weekly reprint or the monthly reprints that are going on now.
Yeah,
And then it gets you into trying to collect all of this other material, including the serialized Life Force, which is huge.
Yeah.
You still have all that, I imagine, right?
Oh yeah.
Because I've seen glimpses of what I believe is a very impressive repository for all things comics related. Yes, there is a substantial how shall we put this,
Uh,
collection of goods.
It is. It is. Off the top of my head, there's probably close to 20 long boxes of comics, plus and a number of shelves of collected editions, be they trades, original graphic novels, reprint, all that stuff. Just every shelf in my other room is full of DC Archives editions, showcase, the showcase editions that DC did, the black and white reprints of those books, Marvel Essentials, those things. It's just tons of stuff everywhere. You can't
That's
you can't go into a room without seeing comics. And now, because I've been doing the DCN thing for so long, and the podcast, and I did that chapter in the Batman book and stuff, there's always comics on the dining room table too, where my laptop is set up, because I'm always writing something and referencing something, and oh well, there's my next project. I'm getting that together. If I have a chance to look at that, it's out. So there's comics everywhere. My wife is amazingly patient, because it wouldn't always have been like that, but for me to have taken over the dining room with the comics everywhere. But she knows how much fun it is for me, so she understands, and I get a lot of satisfaction out of doing that kind of thing.
That's awesome. Nothing better than great support from someone who realizes where your passions lie. And there's few things better than acknowledging that, letting them know, like, hey, these are going to be moments where your passion is going to override what the norm might be in a given situation, and gradually it might actually alter that concept of norm, so that this is the new normal, right?
I'm still not allowed to play drums in the garage when she's home, though. That's about where the line is drawn, though.
I'm pretty sure there's plenty of people watching and listening right now who are like, yeah, I'm okay with that. Not everybody loves the drums. Those who do love it, with a passion, and a wonderful one. I had a lot of friends who were I had a lot of great friends who were great nerds, and many of them were in things like band. And a couple of those guys, man, the ones who got in percussion, Like every time you're around them, it was they're all tapping stuff and making noises, and you're just like, okay, all right, man, I, I get it. I figure everyone else has too, but love you. And then it just becomes part of the new normal. So you got to chuckle. Now, here's the thing I really keep in mind, and I would love for people to get an understanding of, because I think it might really provide a wonderful framework for everything we're going to be talking about, which is it sounds like you were into comics before you discovered Will Eisner and the Spirit. And I'm curious what that had been like prior, and then what that discovery of the Spirit changed and Will Eisner changed for you as far as what comics had meant before. It's kind of like a before Will Eisner and an after Will Eisner.
Oh, wow.
What
Okay.
was life like? Because once you discovered these comics, you had been collecting for or interested in comics for how long beforehand? And then what did this mean to discover this work and what it meant for what you did with comics after?
Well,
Big
Pete,
question.
no, that's a great question. And I was thinking of a really funny answer, like, before Liza, everything was sad and dull. And no, but that's not true. When I'm not quite sure how old you are, but I'll be 51 in April. And every people my age, when we were kids, everybody got comics as kids. I mean, when you were 3, 4 years old, you had, Bugs Bunny or Donald Duck or something, because your parents gave you things to entertain with. And here, read this comic, look at this comic. Um, I have my two oldest like superhero comics that I have that I know I got when they were brand new were Wonder Woman 211 and Detective Comics. I think it's 484. They were both 100-page giants, so they had an original story in the front, and then the detective actually is one of the ones with the Archie Goodwin, Walt Simonson Manhunter series from the 70s. So it's one of
Ooh.
those issues. And I had no idea what I was reading it, that
You're
because
how
it was
old?
4. That's 1974.
Right.
Yeah, I have no idea what I'm reading, but then also both books had a bunch of reprints. They're 100 pages, 100 super spectacular books. And I know I started getting comics then, when superhero comics, and I had a few here and there as a kid, as we all did, of Marvel and DC stuff. But I think it was probably the Batman '66 TV show and the Spider-Man animated series from the '60s that were always in reruns and syndication when I was a little kid, 4 or 5 years
Mm.
old. There is a picture of me. And I remember doing this, playing with my Spider-Man Mego figure while watching the show on TV at 4, 5, 6 years old. So I knew I got comics into comics really early. And then uh, we traded. I don't know if I ever traded comics with friends, but I remember going to the 7-Eleven and the newsstand with friends, and we would buy comics. And then Heroes Aren't Hard to Find opened up in Charlotte when I was 10 years old, and my mom saw a uh, newspaper article about it. And we, one Saturday, went down there, and oh my gosh, there's a whole store devoted to comic books. And here were these long boxes of old comics. So this is, and you're looking at comics that are from the 60s and such. And I'm, 10, 11 years old at this point, and it's hard to wrap my brain around what I'm looking at. And I went to the Heroes a few times. Every couple months we'd go, and I'd get a couple back issues or a new big here or there. And then when I turned 11, I got a gift certificate from my parents to Heroes. And I not only got some new comics and such, but I got the Overstreet comic book price guide, the 11th edition that had just come out. It was on my birthday. And that just opened my brain up to a wealth of uh, information. And that's kind of what sort of locked me into comics as more than just, you know, simple simple entertainment. I started looking at it as something I wanted to be involved with and collect. And I started to pull lists then and got, only 5 books a month or something, you know. Uh, so I was reading superhero comics, basic Marvel and DC stuff at that point. Um, Finding Will Eisner's Spirit showed me that there was a whole other world of comics and things called comics that were very different from reading the monthly adventures of Spider-Man, Batman, Superman, the standard. This is before direct direct sales had really started. This is before uh, DC launched Legion of Superheroes and New Teen Titans Baxter editions in '84. This is before that, so comics were still uh, mostly sold on newsstands at the time. So to find this stuff that was really different was would really change my view of what comics could be. And I think one of the biggest changes is in getting that spirit stuff. It led me to Milton Caniff and Steve Canyon and Terry and the Pirates and other newspaper strips, and seeing comics as an art form, as a unique storytelling medium that is not film, it's not illustration, it's not picture books that are illustrated, it's not prose. Obviously, there's so many different things you could do uh, with comics and how you can tell stories with comics that you can't do in any other medium. Sure, we are so excited about all these comic book films that come out because it's the characters we know and love, but it still doesn't translate exactly. There's something different about the experience. And that's what I think seeing the stuff Eisner did and the other things that um, finding the spirit in Will Eisner led me to discover, especially newspaper strips. I'm going to be big on newspaper strips because they are significantly different from even the regular comic book experience because the way you have to tell the story. And I mentioned this in my Terry and the Pirates episode that it's just so much more mature what the stories are about than your simple 10, 12 page story from Golden Age comics. Which don't get me wrong, I love those, but it's so different in the newspaper strips than what you got in the comics, especially the later '40s when things really got going. And I guess, anyways, so that's really the difference. So, did that answer the question? That was a long answer. I kind of forgot where I was for a minute. I was like, I'm talking about myself and a 4-year. Oh wait, yeah, Will Eisner. That's right.
Well, you gave us a great context for what your experience to comics had been before that. Uh, mine, I'm a little bit younger than you, but not by that much. And you're actually pretty close to my wife's age. And so that's a pretty good frame of reference, for me, because I was aware of some things that had come before I sort of gained any awareness of what's going on in the world or, what is happening around me, and that certain things would be in rerun. But I was also lucky enough to come of age during a time when like the Wonder Woman TV show was a big deal. And I had the world's biggest crush on Linda Carter, and no one could, top my absolute love for her. And the fact that she every once in a while would spin and wear a different Wonder Woman outfit. Like the one where she goes underwater, hands
That's
down
the
to
first
this
one I
day.
think of. Yep, yep.
Yeah,
I remember
it's
that.
it's
Yeah.
one of my favorite episodes to this day. I can think of that moment exactly and be like, that is the coolest concept. Everyone should be able to spin in a circle and have the exact outfit they like. It was just it opened my mind to the possibility. But I think you've also introduced that idea, which is really important, which is what comics have been so far. I mean, up to the point when someone discovers them, there's a whole history that predates that moment of discovery. And that's a really fun idea because that's where so much of Will Eisner's earliest impressions were made in that history. And yet there's also the reasons why. Keep in mind that, as you said, there were so many different houses at the beginning. There were so many different companies publishing books. There were so many different ways to approach the medium. And then there were people who were doing things that defined certain mediums, gave them a structure in a way that others looked to and said, that's utilizing the medium. That's understanding what the medium is possible and also how to use all of its possibilities to tell great stories. And with that is also the idea that people were getting these in books sometimes, but also you had the strips. I'll hopefully get a chance to talk about it when it becomes public. But I recently got the chance to work on a web strip series.
Oh,
I'm only
cool,
about eight
cool.
episodes in, but the concept for me writing it, because I've just done the writing side, has changed the way I think about stories. Like I tried to read, I tried to look, I read through McLeod's understanding, I was reading
Mm.
through some Will Eisner stuff, and then there's the application of it and the whole way that you want to like understand what you work. I still feel like a babe in the woods. It's really fun for me. I've written a couple of other comics scripts that I'm curious to see when I get a chance to start talking about them more publicly. Right now, I can't. I just I'm allowed to allude to the fact that I've written them,
Right,
but it's
right.
it's really hard to share a lot. But it also, in the process, just exposes your understanding for what it is that you believe you're experiencing, and then also what it is you can understand through a reread or when compared to something else. So what really sort of catches me is one, you saw not only from this experience what the value that Will Eisner had brought to comics through the spirit and was continuing to do, and then also in the long form. But then it turned your eye towards what also, the fact that he had done a strip that had existed for so long that had also shown what possibilities existed within comics, which then led you to other comic strips. And then that all comes to this other idea, which I love, which is that when you're talking about comics, yes, we are all excited about the movies. One of the reasons we're excited is because the technology's at a level where it can actually, as closely as possible, represent these things that occurred in comics, which even when they try, they come close, but they never quite match the glory, the wonder, the atmosphere that somehow comics can create through certain images, certain splash pages, certain styles that you just look at it and you're watching the film and you're going, they came pretty close on that one. Or these are some moments where they actually like did their best to take that and put it here. But just because that's what they're going for, it doesn't mean they always get it, right?
Or that they understand it.
Right.
And I think sometimes they'll do a great job and they'll have an image. First thing I'm thinking of is the Daredevil movie by Mark Steven Johnson with Ben Affleck, and the opening to that, to me, that is he understands what he's doing. I think with that opening scene where you hear the pounding and you don't know what it is, and you realize it's the rain falling the way he's hearing it, and the rat running along the street, and then the camera goes to the street and it pans up the front of the church, and you're like, what's, and then there's Daredevil hanging onto the cross on the church, and you're like, all right, you not only get it, you actually took a scene from an actual comic and and proved your nerd quotient, because that's right out of a comic, and it was just perfect. Um, and that, to me, he got it. But a lot of times, I think they don't tend get to get it. They don't always understand what they're doing. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, and that's kind of where the disconnect is, because I think filmmakers don't always understand the form and how it's told differently, and how that impacts the stories that are told. And it's great to be able to translate, uh, like I said, these characters and stories you love. But to me, often character is missing in the movies, and it they'll make a change that seems uh, what's the word I'm thinking of? Arbitrary. They'll make it's like, why would you change that? Why would you make that different? Why don't you just do it like it is in the comic? Because that's proven to work and it's important to the character. Just make him like he is in the comic. You don't need to change that just for your movie. I understand they make changes. Like just quickly, Batman 89, you make the Joker the Batman's parents' killer. I understand that, so that as a single movie, it's a single story without these things that are missing and loopholes that are open, and plots dangling, that, well, who killed his parent? That's a separate story in the comics. But they made it one story, so it's a singular film, I guess, an experience. And I guess the problem there is, we're still not the intended audience. The intended audience is still as many people as they can get. But I don't necessarily think, I think they underestimate the audiences in general, that you can keep it comics accurate and still get the broader audience. You don't have to simplify it in order to get more people.
I agree. It seems at times they don't always trust the viewer to have the intelligence to understand something that's lifted directly from the comics and bring it into the movie, that something has to be changed in order to make it accessible or hold a different value so that you can attract a wider audience. But in actuality, the audience is more likely going to respect you for actually taking the time to, be true to the material, put it up, and also let them know that you're listening to what the writer and the storyteller and the artist in that comic work were saying, and you understand it enough to put it on the screen in a way that audiences that know it will say that's what it should be, and audiences that have never seen it before will say, wow, I'm so glad I've experienced this. It would have been great to experience in the comics. This is something I should be enjoying more of. And that's where the understanding, I think, is often missing. That's where the disconnect really seems to occur.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
and I think it's important because if we, turn the conversation back to Will Eisner, in many ways, compared to the others around him, what he was doing in comics just, it felt, it looked, it still feels and looks so very different, as though, like
Oh
you're
yeah.
describing, he in every situation begins with that sense of, where am I and how do I explain to the reader what's going on, and make them as part of this story as possible. And it also felt like in doing that, that he was doing things that seemed so authentic to what he was doing, but also seemed so free that he would simply approach them, like you described with that example you mentioned. uh, the spirit hanging from a tree because he needs to get high enough to get the leverage to get his legs around a guy who's bigger than him, which
Yeah.
basically says to me, Will Eisner at some point created a character bigger than the spirit and said, okay, now how do I beat him?
Yeah.
But in doing that, he didn't make it where like the spirit had to like pull out some fancy ray thing or have some invention. He just had to use what he had, which was this, in his bones desire to fight crime and to do whatever was needed to make that happen. um, Comparatively, it just felt like what he was suggesting was, hey, this is what's possible. Did you notice? Because I'm going to show it to you. And each time I'm going to show you something different because it's what I've discovered and it's what I think makes this story so original, so specific, and why I never felt like any of his two stories were really the same.
He handles a lot of the same themes in his work, and a lot of his stories, whether they are spirit stories or they are uh, his original graphic novels and such. He's writing a lot from life and his own experiences, especially with his post spirit work. It's I think it's nearly almost all based on his experiences growing up and working through his own life and what he saw and how those things affected him as a person. And he's really writing about people more than anything else. And to me, I think that's one of the linchpins of his work is that he's writing about people, whether they're real people he knew, whether they're amalgamations of people he knew. He's creating characters, and he's writing about characters. Even in the spirit, once he really gets going after the war, he's writing about people. It's not so much even about the spirit. The spirit is almost like a vehicle for telling other stories. He's not really interested in telling stories about the spirit. He wants to tell stories about the human condition, about what it's like to be somebody who's either misunderstood or something like that. And the spirit is just the vehicle to get to tell that story because that's what he's interested in. And the spirit just happens to be the vehicle he had at the time and his outlet to tell the stories. That's why once we get to his original graphic novels and stuff in the 70s and 80s and even 90s, and he was creating all the way up until the time he died. Uh, it's about people, and sometimes it's like I said, it's real people. Sometimes it's autobiographical or semi-autobiographical, but it's always about character, and that's what I think draws me in because I've learned about myself, whether it's a movie, a regular prose novel, comics, whatever I'm watching. I want the characters. I want the characters and the real human emotions and the relationships. That that's that's what does it for me. Thinking in terms of comic book movies, I think my favorite example of that is Captain America, Black Widow, and the Falcon in Winter Soldier. Their relationship, and that movie. Sure, it's about Shield and Hydra and all that stuff, but more than anything else, though, it's those three plus adding Bucky's character as they're trying to bring him back. Those uh, those three characters, how they relate to each other, and the real human emotions involved that they get so right in that movie that it doesn't matter if they change some of the incidental stuff with the comic accuracy bits. That's what draws you in. That's what makes it a great movie. They didn't adapt Ed Brubaker's story exactly, but they used the basic ideas and they had that core friendship between the three of them, and then of course Winter Soldier himself. And that's what makes it, and that's what makes Eisner stuff so good, is that it's real people and you can relate to that. And I did make notes about in after rereading this for getting together today, so I would have something specific to turn to. And as we're talking, I'm starting to think about some of the things I wrote down. So we'll get to that at some point. But yeah, it's this people, the real emotion that is what I think Eisner draws you in. But of course, with Eisner, you got to talk about how he does it also, because it's a special medium, as we've discussed already, that's unlike anything else. So he's doing things that are, it's not your simple, 6-page panel comic with, a caption and some dialogue here and there. And he's doing different things and stuff. But we'll get to that as we get into the book itself. I won't
Well,
jump too far ahead.
that's okay. Let me actually offer this as a segue because it was a great opportunity when I was talking with Danny last year, and it's my first introduction to Will Eisner. And it was when I was lucky enough to, so nearby my junior high and high school was the local library where I grew up. And I could go to the comic shop, but I couldn't always afford everything at the comic shop. So before I had fully invested in like just giving over my paychecks to comics and accepting that that was my fate for a period of time, I was also looking for ways that I could enjoy comics through the library. Because every once in a while I'd discover something where I'd be like, where did this comic in the library show up? What happened? And so I found that there was actually a section of history on comics, and I discovered this book. And it was lovely because it went through the history by showing reprints of great moments in comics. And one of the ones that blew me away and to this day still impacts me is Berhard Schnabel.
Oh, okay, okay.
And what also stuck with me was within a year or two of that, discovery, the band Pearl Jam, which was a big '90s fixture, had come out with their second or third album. I think it was their third, and on it was a song called "Given to Fly," which, when I would listen to it, I swore felt like the story of Berhard Schnabel. And I would have never made that connection until I had discovered this. But also, the story of Berhard Schnabel is the thing that attracts me the most to what you're talking about, which is the characters. Because I felt in that story, and this book did a wonderful job of highlighting this. We got to see that Will Eisner was telling a story about the spirit chasing some bad guys. But what was actually the story that pulled me in, and I believe most readers, is the story of this guy named Berhard Schnabel, who has a miserable office job that he hates, people that he doesn't like, and he has a gift that he never shares with people, and that's that he has the ability to fly. And he suddenly hops out of a window and flies around in like full, and I'm sitting there going, how does this happen in the 40s? And it's Eisner saying, hey, you don't know it didn't happen, because by the end of the story there's a tragic ending, and only the spirit really has a sense of what might have occurred, and only the reader knows the full extent of what's happened or the full story of Berhard Schnabel. And I suddenly, through that moment, also became aware of the fact that this the spirit I might have heard referenced at times or seen glimpses of had now shown to me that comics for a period of time, when they weren't just about the newest, because also when I'm discovering this is the 90s, right? So I'm
Yeah.
surrounded
Oh,
by
Image and
image,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And it's just like,
Wolverine
big
is on
flex
9 out of
and
every 10
yeah,
Marvel comics.
right. Well, not only that, but everybody has to have like headbands and
Yeah.
gauntlets and leg straps and holsters and bands and bandoliers. And there was a lot, and flexing. And, there was
Yeah.
just a lot of like overdeveloped visual appearance. And yet, before that, had been these stories that told these beautiful, quiet moments and suggested like mystery and magic and wonder without needing to go into well, it's because of a gem or this and that. It was just, it exists. It's been put into the story. It's happening. It's appearing for the time that it is. And guess what? Like all kinds of things that happen that people never really see, but can happen, it it ends, and only we, the reader, are the wiser for it. That for me opened up that idea of character. Is this a story you're familiar with? Have you read
Oh,
Berhardt's novel?
absolutely. Multiple times. Yeah, absolutely. As soon as you said it, I imagined the image of him, when he's flying and his arms are out to the side of the airplane and he's, you know, that's exactly what I saw as soon as you said it. Yeah. Well, as you're saying this, I think there's a message here in the kind of stories like that that says if you don't sometimes slow down and try to see what's around you, you'll miss amazing stuff. In this case, it's something I'm not going to jump out this window next to me right now and fly away. And you're going to be like, holy crap, what happened? That's not going to happen. But what are we missing in the world if we don't pay attention? What kinds of people are we not aware of, not seeing? Which reminds me of the graphic novel Invisible People by Eisner. Uh,
Another
and
great example.
yeah, and so it's that's kind of what, to me, the deeper message in a story like Gerhard Schnubel is about. It's not being aware of what's around us and missing the like you said, the beauty and the magic in everyday life. It doesn't have to be some guy flying around, but there's something missing, and to miss it is tragic.
And also the fact that I think it really opened my eyes to just how much we overlook, how much, you like, I mean, Ferris Bueller, life moves pretty fast. You don't stop, take a look around, you're going to miss something. That's clear, and that's evident from Will Eisner. But it's also the idea that sure, there's catching it when it happens, but there's also take a look around, because you don't know who's holding something magical inside of them right now.
Right.
And I think at times comics have done a wonderful job of having characters who have amazing abilities, but in the real world they are, in the eyes of others, useless. Like they can't hold a job, they can't keep it together, they've got emotional issues, they've probably got trauma of some kind of PTSD from what they've experienced because of what they can do. And yet at the same time, we're human beings, our abilities of perception and understanding, but only sometimes. Otherwise, it's always been this idea of, I have a power,
Uh,
I've discovered that I now must use my power for good. There is no question, there is no doubt or uncertainty, it's just given, right? and
yeah.
and there's a healthy, opportunity, a spectrum from disheveled, broken mess to upstanding, perfect figure, epitome of all things. And
Yeah.
he did a wonderful job of showing us so many levels of that. And I always thought Bernhard was a great example of, one, pay attention to what's going on around you. You could miss magic if you're too busy rushing on with your life. But two, even if it's not happening, you don't know who around you has that thing inside them. And like you, is hoping that someone else will get the chance to see what makes us beautiful, wonderful, specific people who want to be
Yeah.
recognized for what we have and rarely, if ever, get the chance to have that recognition.
It it reminds me of I have a background in art history. I have a master's in art history, and it reminds me of how many wonderful, wonderful, amazing, iconic artists throughout the entire history of art. Uh, we look, we Can I thought you froze for a second. Are you good? Did you hear all that? Oh,
I noticed you froze a little bit too, so I tell you what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna try and switch to another. I have two Wi-Fi options, so I'm gonna switch to my second one and see if that gives us a better signal. If for any reason it kicks us off or anything like that, I will just restart the recording, but it'll be fine. Because I don't know what's causing it, but I know that sometimes if I switch to another Wi-Fi option,
I've
it can
lost you
help.
for a second, Seth.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and switch then.
You're there. I'm losing. I lost my volume.
Recording. Yeah, so that's why I put in the second one because I know sometimes the main one will get a little futzy. And
okay.
so there's this part of me that was like, okay, in the future, I will have a secondary Wi Fi ready to go. And should life get interesting, switch on over to the other guy. We should be recording again.
Okay.
So, yeah, yeah, it was weird. Right before you saw me freeze, you froze up. And I was like,
Okay.
and then you're like, hey, you're frozen. And I'm like, okay, well, we're both in this. And so let's bring it back just for a second. We were just talking about, how it is that we all have this thing in us that we would love
Yeah.
for others to experience. And
Yeah.
Will Eisner was telling that story through Berhard and through so many of his other characters in one of the recurring themes that you had referred to that he often loves to tell stories about the human beings, the people who aren't the superheroes, the people living everyday lives, their quiet moments of tragedy and
Yeah.
and what they're experiencing because the medium has the ability to show that to us. It has the ability to make that seem fresh and new and also open our eyes to something we don't normally pay attention to. Um, I feel like that's not a bad way for us to segue into Contract with God. And
Here's my copy from 1985.
yeah, you have me beat on that one. I completely accept that. This was actually something that I've been. I don't know. I have certain books that I get, and I've still got wrapped in plastic because to me they're that moment. Because when I open them, it's a gift to myself. Like
Mhm.
I've created that time where I'm going to sit down and enjoy that. Contract with God was one of those I waited for a long time to pick up,
Okay.
and getting the chance to read it before we talked, I'd seen so many references from that history of comic books I mentioned in the library,
Yeah. Yeah.
and other examples throughout. But reading it all the way through was a really powerful experience, and I would love to get some context because you read it before I did, and also you got your copy in 1985. You had also, as you mentioned, heard about it.
Yeah.
Looked into other works by Will Eisner before you got it, and then you eventually got it. What was that like the first time, and then reading it through recently again? What was it like to experience it those two ways?
When I first got it, I got a contract with God and a couple other of his. I know I got a signal from space probably at the same time, and I mean I'd heard this is the first graphic novel. This is the first uh, time someone has written a longer form book is like a single story, and the fact that it wasn't about superheroes I felt was significant. And I was still at that point in my life where, so what do you mean their comics not about superheroes? Because you're a kid and you're reading comics and it's superheroes. At least from most of my experience when I was younger, and I think I was just shocked at the time at how adult it was. I think it it went over my head in some ways. I think because I could certainly look at it and appreciate um, what he's doing visually and his technical skill in both his storytelling as well as the actual images themselves. But I think in rereading it recently for this, I got a much better understanding of what he's doing as far as the themes and that aspect of the human condition that he's addressing in each of the individual stories, because it's not a single story. It sounds like it's a single story, but it's 4 stories. And I think it has taken, my own maturity uh, as an adult to be able to go back and understand a lot of the things that are in the book that I didn't get probably at the time. I mean, I knew I had to have it at the time, and I knew that I had to read it, and it was an important work. And like I said, I got some of it, but I don't think it's until you're older that you've had some more life experiences, maybe some that are similar, uh, that you can relate to, that makes it more important. But also is when you're young and you're growing up and you're a teenager, some of the stuff, like in the story The Super, he's got all the naked ladies on the wall, and as a kid you're just like, you're more titillated than anything else because you're a 15-year-old boy and hear all these naked lady pictures on the wall, and you're like, which is why, you weren't allowed to have them. That's why Shelton was like, yeah, you can't have this. Mrs.
Right.
Lloyd, I don't think your son should have this because, you know, and there's no interview with Jack Kirby in this book, but, it's so as a kid, I think until you're older and more mature, you're going to miss some of the stuff that's in there, and what he's doing, what he's doing with some of the twists that are in the stories. And I think of the very last page of the very last story with the oldest son standing on the balcony, just sort of staring off. And until you're older, you don't get what's happened to him really and what's changed, because you're 15 years old, you're still a kid. It's for whatever you may think of yourself as a 15-year-old, you're still a kid.
Whatever your maturity might be, you're still excited by what's new. And
Hmm.
for most 15-year-olds, there's a possibility that what you pointed out, the TNA is
Yeah.
what really draws the eye. That's what really is going to be your focus. And so much of what else is going on can be lost in that. I do think, when you're talking about that feeling of what it's like to try and understand what this means before you've had the life experience that he's reflecting on. The message isn't as clear. If I was reading this at 15, I would be more excited by the idea of being 15 and an older woman, like,
Yeah.
wanting to seduce me, as is
Yeah.
suggested in one of the stories, or the idea of, like, being old enough to just have all these, this access to girly mags or stuff
Yeah.
like that you're not allowed. It's forbidden. So
Yeah.
there's like this, like, possibility of, like, oh wow, so when you're older you can do what you want, and all this stuff that you're not allowed to get to, you can get to. But he doesn't paint it in like a glorified way. It's not
No,
like the
no.
guy, with the stuff on the wall is the guy you want to be. He seems really unhappy. He seems a little broken down, at least physically. His features just feel like
Oh
weighed
yeah.
down. Everything about it feels like it's not quite sorted, not quite tawdry, but very depressing in its own context. And that's a truth and honesty I really.
It's amazing he makes you feel sad for him though. Makes you think,
Yes.
you empathize with him. He, even though he's he's set up as the person that nobody likes in the building, the super, because he's kind of a jerk and stuff. And then you see that he's just all by himself, alone. The only thing he has to keep himself company are these, you know, pictures on the walls, and it's funny because it reminds me of being a kid and going to like get the oil change somewhere with my dad, and you know, and then around the
You see
corner
that
when
calendar.
you take 1 or 2 steps too far, and then there's this calendar, and you're like, why is that in the garage? Why is that in this? And it's a weird. You learn. It makes you question, why are these things here in public with these men working? It's like, is that right? It's just weird at the time. You're like, what? I mean, I would still never put pictures like that up in public to see, but at the time as a kid, it's shocking. And then so in the story, it's the same way. But as an adult, you see it as you see it a little differently instead of as you would as a kid. And he makes you feel sad for the guy. And then by the end, it's one of those tragic endings, and it's everything is about misunderstanding and not seeing what's really going on around you.
Yeah.
And nobody's taken the time to see this guy as a person. He's just the jerk super. You know, can't stand that
The
guy. Yeah,
and as Eisner describes in the intro for the version I have, the super was always a mysterious figure. He was just this guy who was always wandering the halls and fixing the pipes, and there was something like scary about him because he was always grumpy and probably worn down by nagging and complaints and problems and things like that. And also, what I find interesting is that he's the second story in this book. The first one refers to more about the title, the contract with God,
yeah,
and someone who made a contract with God, who, you know, for whatever reasons, at some point at a young age, chose to do the right thing and has continued to do the right thing, and then tragedy strikes, and he questions everything. He changes his whole direction in life, and this story and the stories that follow, interestingly enough, all take place in one location, 55 Dropsy, which is a really interesting way for us to start things off in with that story of Hirsch, and then to shift us all the way through into the other ones. What did you think of Contract with God this time around, or even the first time around?
I uh, I have a hard time remembering my initial reaction,
That's fine.
other than, like I said, I could appreciate a lot of it, and it was so long ago. And like I said, I wasn't old enough to get what I think are the most important things. So I took some specific notes about the contract with God, and I'm just going to start with that because uh, I think it'll kind of point out what we're talking about as far as the viewing it as an adult as opposed to as a kid. Initially, some of the illustrative stuff, the technical stuff, the rain, the way he does the rain in this story is it looks like syrup. It's so thick,
Right.
but it adds a weight to uh, to the story and what he's trying to communicate with the 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 sadness and the heaviness in Freeman Hirsch's life, having just lost his daughter, and the way he uses blacks in suggesting shapes and forms without traditional outlines of figures in some of the scenes, especially page. I think it's right after the I don't know how yours is set up, but it's this page right here when you get to it, and yours
Hmm.
that one there. I mean, he's not really outlined the figure so much as suggested where it is by where the shadows and the blacks are in the back, and the wrinkles on his coat and the bottom of his shoe. It's just really stunning to look at it. And when he's going up the steps 2 pages later with, like I said, the rain looks like syrup. It's so heavy. You can just feel the weight of the rain dragging him down, symbolizing his own pain, having just buried his daughter. Um,
Well, in that
Another,
intro that you're talking about, it's the first one that you showed us, and then these are the 2 pages that move into as you described. And he
yeah,
keeps that
yeah,
idea. It's almost like a. Have you seen the old movie Les Samurai?
no,
Old black and white, and it's about an assassin, 60s, and I believe the actor was actually like a model or model actor, but it's set in France. And the opening scene, I didn't know about this movie until I was watching an old Siskel and Ebert when I was pretty young, because my mom always did. And they were talking about movies that had been re-released because of production quality,
huh?
improvements, things like that. And the opening scene is a room, and it's set in shadow. And sorry, got something stuck on my tongue there. And you can see in the room, like they show the first like 2 minutes of the movie, and you're watching this room, and then suddenly you realize that it's in black and white, a wisp of smoke, and you're like, where's that wisp of smoke? And in the shadows is a man lying on the bed smoking a cigarette, and he's not doing anything more than lying there smoking it, and you don't even know he's there until the black and white contrast shows you the white smoke coming up. And then you're like, oh, there he is. And I feel like that was a wonderful nod to this moment when we start out with this syrup rain that's pouring down. And then you can just pick out this guy. And then over the next 2 pages, you're just following this guy as he's moving through. It's almost like, watching an ant trying to go through a horrible deluge. And you're like, how's this guy going to make it? This is like
Yeah.
torrential rivers. And somehow makes its way up. And yeah, it's this guy like climbing into this place. But as you said, it provides that emotional context because something really heartbreaking has occurred for him. And then you were going to keep going. I cut
Yeah.
you off.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So for me, experiencing this story as an adult, here's what I get out of it, and it's just not the kind of subject matter you expect to find in comics. But to me, this is about a man's relationship with God and how uh, man perceives one's relationship with God. It also shows the cyclical elements of Freeman's experience. It plays out over and over again. People will always have this struggle. It shows the transition of someone who is spiritual to materialistic. Uh, it, it's almost a reversal of the story of Job in the Bible, where Job is constantly tested and tested, and he never gives up his faith. But here, Freeman Hirsch is angry at God, and instead of trying to move forward because his faith, he loses his faith and he turns to the materialistic world, the materialistic things. And but you can see he's constantly trying to find his way back to God in the story. He doesn't totally give up. But he's hurt enough that he's gone away and he's trying to come back. Uh, but he doesn't seem to understand that you can't do it on his terms. He's got to do it on God's terms because God's not going to change. But Frima Hirsch has to change. He has to have that change. Uh, and I think what is so significant about that is that depending on one's own spirituality, we all have moments in our lives where if we are believers, we feel like just like Job, why is this happening to me? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why has this happened and what does it mean? And I thought God was good and all these things. And I think that's something that I saw this time that I didn't get as a 15-year-old kid. Because even as a 15-year-old kid, whatever your spirituality is like, it's really fresh still compared to being 50 years old and all the different aspects of your life that are going to impact how you view God and spirituality and the way the world works. So I don't know if Eisner himself was trying to say something about his own uh, view of God and any sort of spirituality, but it, that's how I saw this time, which was certainly something I totally would have missed at 15.
I think you're raising some interesting points here, and it's important to keep in mind. When we're talking about a contract with God, one of the first things is that the story begins with a death. Frima Frima Hirsch has lost someone important to him, and along his life, he's always been told that his good works would lead to a reward.
Mhm.
And he believed that bringing up a child that wasn't his, an orphan, and making sure that she had everything he could offer, is taken away from him when she is lost to a tragic disease. And in his forward to this one, he mentions the fact that this is a story about Will Eisner's personal life, the death of his daughter, the uh, the tragedy involved with that, and how he wanted to tell that story and he couldn't for a long time. And the only way he could was through this character, but he had to distance it enough from himself by making the character's loss through an adopted daughter. He couldn't
Mm.
make it a blood relation. It was too close to the story that he had experienced. And then also in it is this concept of a boy who, which, you know, as we all start out at some point at our youngest selves, Frimer Hirsch was this kid who just did the right thing, who always did good by others, and was always told, and I felt this was important, that he would be rewarded for his good works. And at some point as a child, he makes a decision to pick up a stone after having a conversation with a leader of his faith and saying, all right, if this is the deal, then I'm going to write down this contract with God in stone,
He
like
was setting in stone.
like a 10 commandment or something.
Yeah,
Like the
yeah.
reference point feels so beautiful and archaic, and yet and also like so timeless. Like what outlasts stone? You know, like very few things outlast rock. Even when we think of the petrified wood, like in some way it's been, you know, ossified to become this bone
Yep.
stone like
Yep.
structure. And in the doing so, he makes this agreement. But with the loss is the feeling of, what did it all get me? What did all these good works get me? You know, now here I am at this point where the best thing I could have had is taken away from me. And now all I can see is loss and heartache. And I'm caught by the idea, as you suggest, that he then makes a decision to forswear all that he's been doing, make the decisions that will benefit him the best, play a little fast and loose with money that isn't his, and yet still come out on top, but always searching for that way to get back what he once had in the way he remembers it. You know, that idea of how we picture things when we're young and how we expect them to be, and when the reality comes into play. And you brought up faith, which I think is a good point, because that's the reference point that Eisner is using, and he makes a point of that. But I feel like also he's talking about something that goes beyond faith, in that we come into being in the place where we are, and we come to understand the way things have existed before us and how they'll probably exist after us. But at some point, we make a deal with what is going on and what we want. And as we move forward, at some point, we realize that we no longer want to play the game by the world's terms, by the terms of the place we were born into. We want to we want to establish things on our terms. Now, what leads us to that is individual. It's unique and specific to each of us. But it's that transition when we no longer are willing to accept what we have accepted from the world and the way things work. And we decide, no, I want something different. I want something else, or I no longer agree with the way things operate. And that can be in regards to issues of faith or questions of faith. It can be in regards to where we see our future or our possibilities, where we see ourselves eventually going, or what we've agreed is the limits of our possibility. You know, you might think to yourself like, well, I was born here, I'm surrounded by this, and I'll probably end up doing something like one of the people around me, until you
Yeah.
discover that there could be something else you could actually do. And now it's like, well, wait a minute, I don't know if I want to accept these terms that I've been told are the way the world works. You know, for me, I take into consideration my father, who was a, a cotton picker of all
Oh, wow.
things. Yeah, he lived in this little place right outside of Fresno, California, and it was this tiny little town. And from the age of like 5 until he was 18, he picked cotton for like a quarter an hour. Yeah, like you can't compete with my
Wow.
pops when it comes to, like, you can't complain when you were a kid about hard work or things not being fair, because he was just like, my dad had this great saying, life is hard and then you die. Like
Yeah.
that was it, you know. It was a very cut and dry way. But then suddenly Vietnam was approaching, and his brother, who had returned from the Korean conflict as a mortar expert, and said,
Mm.
there's no jobs for guys who have expertise in mortars when they come back to the States. You need to get a trade because you're going to get drafted. And suddenly, this kid from a farm who decides that he's going to enlist before he gets drafted learns a radio trade and leaves his expectations to suddenly like have a whole different approach to his life. Would never have been possible if events hadn't transpired. Because when he goes back to see other people, when he would tell me stories about visiting his home, all the guys he went to school with are still in the same place. All the
Mm.
people he knows, saw what was around them, knew what the expectation was, accepted how it was going to work, and went with it. And up until that time, he had done the same thing until something changed that for him. He had to make a decision for another reason, and I'm struck by that because his term for his reasons for doing what he did were based on one set of circumstances. In this instance, the decision was made by Hirsch to pursue life based on the terms that had been described to him. And yet it was through a tragedy that he suddenly
Yeah.
decides, okay, no longer am I going to play, by the rules of which I'd previously agreed to.
Yeah.
And then in doing so, at some point, he decides he wants to formalize the change. He
Yeah.
wants to, say, okay, uh, everyone around me knows that I'm missing something. How can I get it back? What if I make a new contract? What
Yeah.
if I write a contract that works for what I want?
Yeah.
And it's
I
my
think,
way of formalizing to the world or to the faith and to the presence that is behind that faith. Like, okay,
yeah.
this is how I'd like to do things from now on.
Yeah.
Talk to me.
Well, I think that's one of the things is that you can't you can't do that. He can't change God in a story. He can't change God, but that's exactly what he wants to do. He wants to pigeonhole God into this contract that because he's solicited the input of the 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 rabbis at the synagogue that this is the best way to do this and such, but he can't. That's what he's not learning. I guess through this. And the other thing, when you told me it was definitely about Eisner's own daughter, it really got me thinking that it is part of the story. Part of what he's working through is understanding that the gift he got was having the daughter, because it's really a situation for Hirsch that he was a single man and this baby just shows up. That really is a gift from God out of nowhere. And that having that child, raising that child, loving that child, even though she dies, um, is still the gift. And it's better to have learning that it's better to have had that experience and had that love in your life than to never have had that child at all. As painful as it is to lose it, I wonder now if that's part of what he was really trying to work through, because that's something I'm seeing now as we discuss it, that I wasn't really quite there the first on the reread recently, but it's making me think about it a little bit even more.
I agree with that. I mean, I feel like the fact that he had the opportunity, and I can also only just wonder what the comparison was like for Will himself, based on his personal story. Like, he'd done everything that was asked of him. He had taken on a responsibility like the Spirit and exceeded at it. He had served his country in the military and went on to write all those beautiful illustrated manuals, and the
Yeah,
hilarious
yeah.
soldier figure who always does things wrong. I can't think of the name at the moment.
Joe Dope.
Thank you, Joe Dope. And Joe Dope, who's showing you how to do it wrong, so you learn how to do it right. Like, he followed all the rules, right? He did everything you would ask for a pioneer to do. He established a way of creating comics that others are still trying to match. He then does his duty by his country through his service, not only just doing the regular job, which was what his designation and classification was in the armed services, but then also going beyond it with the publication. And then moving on to, okay, I'm returning to the form, and now I'm going to continue to grow and develop in my craft. I'm going to keep giving my art to the world. I'm going to keep showing these things that only I know, and only I so far have been able to A, share the way that I do, and B, connect with as many people the way that I do. I'm doing all the right things. And then you take away this thing that was so important to me. You take
Yeah.
away this part of me that I brought into the world, that I cared for as much, if probably not more. I'm sure, to who knows what exponential degrees, more than any other art that I had created. And
Yeah.
yet
Yeah.
none of that's enough. None of that is enough to give me, A, satisfaction, or B, some sort of grace for the thing that I want the most, which is for that person to stay. And that idea of that, experience as he tells it through a man of faith, and as I can only imagine his experience as someone who had just, I look at art as an expression of faith. So I feel like in so many ways, what he was showing us with his art was this expression of like, hey, you gave me skills. This is how I'm going to use them. Like, I'm not going
Yeah.
to sit on my gifts. I'm going to use them. I'm doing what you're supposed to do, which is use
Right.
your skills and gifts to make the world a more informed, a more joyful, uh, a better place. And what do I get for it? What do I have to show for it? And what then do you do afterwards? He presents the possibility, which is you get rid of everything, you give up the faith, and you chase money. And then at some point you try and find a medium. But
Yeah.
it seems in what he suggests in Contract with God that, there's fighting the experience and there's learning from it. And we get the chance to experience a character who fights it, and the consequences are just as tragic as the experiences that lead up to them.
Well, I think, as sad and as distraught as that kind of thing goes when you lose your faith in whatever you believe in, it kind of destroys you. And that's what that's why he keeps trying to get back, because he knows that if he can get back to that, he'll have regained some of that sense of whether it's belonging or place in the world, or whatever that is, that, or that damage, I guess, to the soul that losing your faith does. Um, he's trying so hard to get back to it. I kind of went on two different directions there, but you understand what I'm trying.
Do
Losing that
understand.
damage your soul, and that's an even greater pain, perhaps, than losing his daughter, because now he lost his daughter, but he's also lost all that all that other good emotion that comes through faith and belief, and whether it's in God or a higher power, or maybe even just his talents that he has, what he does in the world to make the world a better place, because he's not doing the same thing anymore in the story. He's, instead of being good old friend Mahershe who always does the right thing, he's out for himself trying to make money. And
And he's forever changed. He
yeah,
knows it,
yeah,
and he's trying to compensate for it, which at some point we're all going to experience. I mean, I think for me, probably one of my biggest, I was like 17, thought I was going to be a really good soccer player,
ah,
tore my ACL, went through 3 total knee surgeries before I eventually gave up playing. And there was this part of me once it happened that was just like, what do I do now? Like,
yeah,
I'm 17. I was at this point where things were supposed to go this way. And I mean, as it is, I'm actually in talks with the doctors about a partial knee replacement soon. I'm only in my
oh
40s,
wow,
but because of what I did, they warned me when I was 17, 18. They were like,
yeah,
when you get the surgery, man, it's going to help some, but you're going to face early arthritis. Your life will always be different because of this
yeah,
moment. And I mean, one of the hardest things I think I remember thinking was there was never a day when I didn't wake up experiencing some sort of pain from this thing that I had felt. And and that was probably a connection I understood from this story, was that feeling of there is nothing that changes, that pain is always there. That pain is a constant once something has happened. It's not something you can negotiate. It's much like the world. You want the world to operate in the way you want it to operate, but the world exists the way it does.
yeah,
And it's how we change in response to the world that's actually so often part of the story, and how much of us were unwilling to change in response. In this story, this character changes dramatically. My change was my own experience, but it's from that point that I can reference that things
yeah,
altered
yeah,
significantly for me. For him, this is when things alter significantly for him. And we all have a moment when there's an alteration to what we were. and then there's who we are, and that change is reflected from that point on. You can never get back. It's like once a
Yeah.
promise is broken, once a spouse cheats on another spouse, or a lie is told, and it changes everything about what was something before that moment and what something is after that moment. And it's like when something happens to such a degree, Tony mentions it a lot. Tony Farina, he refers to it as a paradigm shift. That
Yeah.
moment where everything is shifted, and we get a chance to experience it not only in this story, but then we get this interesting suggestion. I promise this is going somewhere. We get this interesting suggestion that that doesn't mean that there isn't an opportunity for the next time around, that there isn't someone else who has the chance to forge a new contract or to pick up an old contract and potentially have a different fate. Which for me was an interesting twist on this story because it doesn't end with
No,
Forever Hirsch.
it keeps going. It keeps going. To me, it's a sense of that there's a sense of hope still, that at the end, with a new person, and the next time it really could be different, because I guess everybody's different. Everybody has their own experience. And just because that happened with Hirsch, it doesn't necessarily happen with that kid who picks up the stone in the epilogue. It's
And
not,
also,
that part's not set.
right, because I mean, it's also for me, it kind of reminds me of that hope that I always feel. I don't have kids. I've got two four-legged furry kids, but my sister has three, and my parents had me, and people have children. And it reminds me of that idea that I feel that so many parents have when it comes to their children. There's that hope and promise that the things that changed our lives won't change theirs, that the experiences that allowed us to get this far when we wanted to go this far will not be the same things that will affect their children, our children. That there is always hope in each new beginning. There's always possibility in each new beginning, and we get a sort of heartbreaking ending of one story in the first chapter of the contract with God, but then we get this possibility, this hope renewed, this fresh start, which it feels like is a reminder of what we see all around us. For every loss we have is a new life brought in the world. For every person who's losing hope is another one finding faith.
Yeah.
This is part of the thing we're in, you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it keeps
Yeah.
going.
Yeah.
It was there before us, it'll be there after us, and it continues to go. And sometimes even the tragedy and the loss is not the ending. It's just what leads to the next beginning, this
Yep.
this restart. So kind of love that idea because we also then use that to move into the story of the super. And that's something which I love that you brought up, and we've already kind of talked about a little bit. But it keeps us in 55 Dropsy. And then I love the idea that follows, which is the story of how you could get a really cheap form of entertainment with your nighttime / meal by these crooners just hanging out in the street. What did you think about that next story as we moved our way through?
um, the street singer.
Yeah.
Um, is the super the second story in your book? Because mine are reversed.
Oh, you're
The
right. I
street singer.
switched them around.
Okay,
Street
that's
singer
okay.
and then into the super. My brain
Yeah.
did the flop.
I just wondered if mine was different from yours.
No.
The first.
For some reason I slipped them around in my head, and now I'm looking at. I'm like, no. Street singer was number 2. So you're right. So we move into the street singer before we get to the super. So go ahead on that one.
Sure. The street singer is one of those tragic characters that is brought down by his own uh, problems, his own foibles, his inability to. He he's he thinks he's found something, a way out, but he doesn't. He isn't able to change the essence of his life to take advantage of the opportunity. Um, one of the things that struck me about technique, though, and style and storytelling was the fact that after the narration on the intro on the first couple pages to where he is sort of waxing nostalgic about the street singers is then the first actual three pages, he's telling a story with zero dialogue or captions. It's all done simply with pictures. And yet there is absolutely no doubt what's going on uh, in the story. Everything it's perfectly understandable with everything he's got, what's happened. And I think that's a really unique ability to tell stories without any kind of captions or words. And it's not like uh, the, uh, the first few pages of Nick Fury, Agent of Shield #1 by Steranko, where it's just an action sort of thing, which is really cool and all. Here, there's a whole set of emotions and drama that he has to communicate through uh, the lady looking out and dropping the note and his surprise, and he reads it, and the shock and the realization that I'm being appreciated for this. And then you see the look on the woman's face, and she's just totally smitten. It's like, so she feels like, you can tell she feels like this is something new in her life that is going to make her happy. And the next page as well, there's words at the very bottom, but racing off to get dolled up for him. It's just, it doesn't require any words. And that's one of those things you don't often get in comics, is an economy of words to, and let the stories, art tell the stories. I mean, I guess in today's comics, there's a lot more of that. But at the time in 1978, when this came out, there was no notion of letting the words or letting the pictures tell the story almost exclusively.
That's a great moment to point out because it is just flawless execution. And it actually highlights a couple of things for me. I'm reminded that when I was reading through the preface for the version I have, he makes a reference to a series of experimental graphic artists who existed in 1978, who he was encouraged by. And he includes names like Otto Nuckel, Franz Mazaril, and Lynn Ward, and that they published serious novels told strictly in art without text. So I was kind of intrigued by the fact that he was attempting to do something similar at times in his other works. And this is a great example of when he makes it not only like work, but also makes it so real to the reader that there's that feeling of he could do that with
Yeah.
enough time and enough patience. He's shown us that he can do that, and he can do that so well. It also, for me, I think, much like the intro to A Contract with God, highlights the fact that one of the things we haven't really mentioned yet about this book is the fact that it's all told in black and white. There is no color throughout any of this.
Yeah.
And that I was curious what your take on that was, because one, thinking back to black and white being such a staple in weekly strips
Mhm.
and things like that, as well as maybe some of the earliest versions of comic stories before we really moved into the four color and what was the expected. But what so often has now been returned to in things like Batman Black and White
Oh
and
yeah,
other
yeah, yeah.
artistic examples where we're saying, hey, how good are these artists? And sometimes when they'll put up those shots on like Twitter or something where they're like, here's the sketch, here's the ink, here's the color. And sometimes you'll get stuck in those first two, like, what does that look like? How much,
Yeah.
what would a book like that look like? And
Yeah.
now you have this chance with a contract with God, to read an entire book, four amazing stories, all told with only the mastery of light, dark, and shadows in between.
There that makes me think of a couple things. You mentioned Twitter. One of the comic artists I follow on Twitter is Sandra Hope, and she very often has a quick little video of her inking, and some of the stuff she's inking is just like, how do you even see that, let alone delineate, a line like that, or she's like doing this freehand, and stuff. It's really neat to see her stuff when she's doing that. It gives you, I don't know, an insight into the process that I don't think you always get when you pick up the final comic at the store and you read
There's
it,
so
and then
many layers.
yeah, and the effort and the you ever inked a comic book before?
Me?
Yeah.
No.
I did a couple comics for projects in school, and at the time I found it to be so difficult to focus on all those lines over. It was almost excruciating at the time for me. I'd probably be better at it now because I'm older, I'm more mature, I can sit still. At the time I had the hardest time doing that. But to see her art like that and be able to do that, it's amazing. It also makes me think of um, the first issue of Action Comics in the New 52 with Grant Morrison. The artist is Rags Morales. And at the back of the book, there were a couple pages of shots of uninked pages of his work, and my jaw went from here to here. When I saw that, I honestly said, "Why did they ink it?
Right.
Why?" His black and white, his pencils were gorgeous, and that's what Eisner's touch reminds me of. It's that sort of really. I mean, just the look at the way he's doing the buildings and the brickwork and like the rain and the others, or that kind of thing. It just you don't need it. It's a case of, you found a way to tell a story that you don't need the color. We're used to the color, but you don't need it. And not everyone's art works that way. It's the way he places the light in the dark. What is a black area? What is a light area? Where he's using line, where he's not using line. It makes me think of Alex Toth in that way. If you've ever looked at any Alex Toth work, most people are probably familiar with his designs for the Super Friends TV show in the 70s. But you look at some of his artwork later on, and he's just breaking things down to the most simplest forms and stuff. And his black and white stuff it's just like Eisner in that it's perfect like that. And you just don't need that color. You don't need too many lines. I mean, even look at the building in that one shot. It's not even all the bricks aren't even drawn. It's just the suggestion of bricks, and it's enough to tell the story. But it also functions as like in comics, you have to think of not just the individual panel, but the whole page as a work as well. And it helps balance the weight, where it's lighter at the top and all the heavy blacks are down here at the bottom. It's balancing the page and the way you look at it, as well as you know how to read the story, but it balances the overall page as a single piece as well, which is something that doesn't always happen, but when it does, it turns out to be something really special, and that's something he's good at. And I think that just goes along with that. You don't need the color, because the color would quite honestly would ruin that page. You add that color in, and all you're trying to do is make it look like life, but the real life is in the story of the characters. You don't necessarily need everything to be photorealistic. It's that kind of it's art as when it gets into art, it's more of a modern sensibility with an impressionistic sensibility, uh, uh, that kind of an expressionistic sensibility when you talk about the history of art, and it's being able to uh, utilize some of those approaches as opposed to, oh, we're illustrating a story, because you're not illustrating a story, you're telling a story with pictures. So you don't but it doesn't have to be illustration, which is something completely different.
Right.
So that's a long
Yeah.
way of saying I don't need the color. That's okay. I apologize to any professional comic book colorists who I've offended. I'm not talking about you.
No, when they do color, we want it in the story. It's part of the plan. You know, Will clearly had a plan, which was to tell this in black and white. But in doing so, he also made a point of using the black and white to the degrees that you suggested. You know, the point at in that panel, and then in that series of panels we were talking about, that has no dialogue, that has no text of any kind. What's so great is the moments when the bricks are only partially there is when the note is falling down, as though, you know, he's simply telling us, okay, take a look at the page, take a look at that panel. Why is it that you can see the bricks closest to where the note is? Why is it that all the bricks around that appear to, you know, fade away, as though if you were picturing that note falling down, the light around it would get brighter, the details around it would diminish, and only those that are necessary to understand what's near it, like those few bricks right there. And the rest of it is just like the mind's eye, which it feels like he had always. And that when you were talking about Sandra Hope with the inking, it feels like when artists have developed that mind's eye, that they already know how it's going to look when it's done. They're just showing you how they get there, which is such a thing, because it's like somebody saying, I know the way, there's no map, but just follow me. So you're following them, and suddenly you realize what they've done got you right where you needed to, the way you needed to, because they already saw it, big picture, all the way up from the
Yeah.
top. Like they had that eagle eye view, and now they bring it close enough that they're like, okay, let me show you what I just saw, you know. And I feel like in this, he's doing that for us. He's like saying, in each of these panels, I'm showing you what you should be seeing, not what you're looking for. I'm pointing out to you exactly what's important. And then in doing so, he makes us see that note. He makes us see the way suddenly, as we're looking at that guy, a lot of the details around him disappear because he's in the same light looking up with the hope, and everything about him is what's important to us. So it's almost like he does this wonderful job throughout each of these stories of training our eye to understand exactly what we should be seeing, why it's important, why he's not putting effort into the other things, because those are the details that are there, but that when the story is happening to you, you're not really paying attention to, just like we do in real life, just like we're
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
prone to do. We're not going to pay attention to the things maybe we should be paying attention to, because there's the thing that's caught our attention. Um, and then there's this final story, because we've already talked about Super. I've already mixed it up in the order, so we can keep that. But Cookaline, you know, was
Can we go to the super for one thing? Because there's one thing
sure.
in the soup. There's one thing in the super that this time going through it really stunned me.
Please do.
Or really stood out to me. We talked about how he makes us feel sympathy for the superintendent of the
Hmm.
building. But what about the crazy switch with him and the girl? And they've set up the whole thing that the super's this guy that nobody likes. He's a pain. He's always rude and unfriendly, and he's kind of this pervert that has pictures of naked women on the walls, and you can just imagine what he's doing out there by himself. But then it's this little 10-year-old girl that's the real evil one.
Right. There's an
I mean,
interesting moment in there where you
it's just
realize.
shocking. It's just shocking. It's just like, oh my God, go ahead.
Well, the mischievousness, you know, the simply how much can I get away with, that children are so easy. They just know how to embrace that, you know, that idea of
Yeah.
like, what can I get away with? And then you add in with this child just this tiniest bit of maliciousness, that bit of
Yeah.
malice that says, what will other people do if I ask them to? What can I, you know, get away with? And clearly she understands misdirection, because, you know, once she's sort of like, you know, teased him to a degree,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then, you know, gets what she's asking for, then she takes more, and
Yeah.
then proceeds to just like be so destructive to him along the way. It's
Yeah.
this, it's like a Tasmanian devil suddenly shows up and is just dropped into the scene, and you're like, wah, 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 wah. Oh, bye, hon. Wife's heading out for a bit of a quick walk, and
Oh.
giving me the, you know, salute before she heads on out. So wanted to say hi, babe. Bye, babe. But yeah, we suddenly get this Tasmanian devil who drops into the scene and just causes chaos. And suddenly, this guy's life, who we thought up until that moment maybe wasn't much to care about, is completely taken away from. Even the
Yeah.
sad, pathetic things that gave him pleasure are
Yeah.
lost to him now. And whoever he might have been is forever altered by, how he's now perceived.
What but the thing that really got me was that she planned the whole thing because she brought the poison down for the dog. She knew what she was doing the whole time. It was all planned, and that is just so conniving. And I just wonder where this story came from. This is just,
Mhm.
I mean, I don't know what I thought about it when I first read it all those years ago, but reading it this time, it was just wow. Just, I mean, obviously it's, you know, finding the humanity in everyone and not judging books by their cover on both uh on both characters, the little girl or the superintendent. You can't judge either of them because you're missing who the real person is in both
Right.
cases. Uh, but the twist there with that is just a fantastically sophisticated story element that is not that you don't see coming. You're kind of like it just gets weird. It's like, why did this little girl go downstairs? What is she doing? I just thought it affected me in a way that I certainly don't recall from the past. But
No, I'm glad you went ahead and brought it up. I don't want to gloss over the fact that, yeah, there is something specific about this girl when she makes this decision. And you can, as you said, it's plotted. It's planned out. She has a whole idea of what she's going to do. And then there is something uh, horrifying about the ending when she knows that all of this has been caused by her. And once talking to the cops and sort of like doing what's asked of her by adults, she's back there with the box of money.
just counting
That's not
away on the
hers.
step. Nope.
Seeing what she's got and making a plan for what she's going to do next. And I mean, take your pick on whether or not this is a story about evil comes from the strangest of places.
Yeah.
You don't know what you've got till it's gone. Pick your version, but
Yeah.
the way this, as you said, this girl is introduced to this story and does such horrible things to this guy that not only do we feel for him afterwards, but we're also horrified at the possibility of this child and others like them existing in the world, what they could potentially do to us, what danger we are in, from any child who's like, how can I take away everything you love,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
it is that in the most unexpected places, and even the things that we secretly might desire that maybe we shouldn't, maybe those things that are forbidden are not just forbidden because they're wrong for us to want and desire, but also because you don't know where evil exists. You don't know that
Yeah.
that bright, innocent desire you have or that object that you so want might actually be the very thing of your undoing. The
Yeah.
very, it's a horrifying idea to consider. And to his credit, Eisner brings it out in such a way that it's not built up, that you should expect that from her. But once
Yeah.
she starts events in motion, you're just busy trying to keep up like him. You're lost, you're confused, and then suddenly it's all
Yeah.
come to this like shocking ending.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I am thankful that you brought that up. I probably could have found a way to just totally like obscured that from our conversation and let people like, wow, I wonder why you just moved. I think it was because I had made such, mistake earlier with Super and then had already referenced it. I was like, okay, have we talked enough about the Super? But you point out that we haven't. And now that we have mentioned that, I feel our conversation is more complete. Did you have any other notes you wanted to add that you maybe
No,
had taken?
no. That we hit that. I just I just wanted to make sure we got that. I'm ready for Cookaleen, the last
Now,
story.
Cuckoline caught my attention too because it's another one of those in which Eisner says the experience of the boy at the end is actually as close to an experience he had as he could portray it in this comic. Was that something you've been aware of?
I wasn't, but I believed it was him when I read it this time because the character name is Willie.
Mm-hmm.
There are other times he references himself in some of his stuff when you can tell it's supposed to be him or a near approximation to him. The character is named Willie. I've seen that before. And then the way he draws the boy, especially that last page,
Mm.
that's the way, that's him. That's just the way he kind of drew himself. Other times I've seen, I got that much out of that. I thought it was, I was pretty sure it was him. I was surprised he would share that much about his personal life like that, but I thought it was him. Yeah.
Yeah, I was surprised by it too, because then I also took it into context and remembered who this boy is. You know, he's part of a family that's got its own story going on,
Golly
even
Moses,
outside
doesn't
of
it?
his.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then it's just one of the many stories that we get to discover, and it's this idea that I feel like unless you knew about it at the time, or unless you read a story like this, it's a brand new idea that people would leave the city for the summer, that they would find a place to go. That if you were, in your late teens, early 20s, maybe you would go off to these places where you could have a little adventure. Knew that people with money sometimes like to hang out, and maybe you could find a leg up on your station in life.
Yeah.
And how often that leads to misfortune for at least two characters.
Um, the reason why I knew about that people left the city in the summer was like that. It's in the movie The 7 Year Itch. You ever seen that movie with
I do remember
Tom
that
Yule and
movie.
Marilyn
Yeah,
Monroe?
yeah,
It opens with Tom Yule's character sending the family off to the mountain out of the city for the summer because back then, no AC, the city would have been hot and
sure.
miserable. And if you could get out, you would. And so the husband would stay home. And you could tell that other people did it too. It was a bunch of people. It's just how things were, I guess. It's just a different experience than we would have now because I would not think of sending my, did you hear sirens? I think that was here.
Okay. Yeah, no, I heard something, and I can never tell at times if I'm getting a noise like my dog whining, which can sometimes sound
Oh,
like a chair squeaking, but I'm like, oh man, because I have to put on the headphones so that they don't hear your audio, because that'll set my dog
oh,
crazy. Like I've
oh,
learned to
right,
use
right, right.
headphones because it's actually how I control the output of sound. But then because of that, anything that's going into the mic, I'm only going to pick up what I'm hearing through here. I'm
Uh-huh.
not picking up anything that's going on around me. So suddenly I might hear a noise and I'm like, oh man, that's a loud noise. I'm going to move real quick. You know, if someone's slamming a door or if there's a dog barking or something, and all it takes is one package delivery and the dogs can bark. And I just like, I have to check to hear if I can hear it. Because if I can, you can, and anybody watching listening. So that's just my little check there. But
Okay.
so yeah, you were talking about the 7 year itch, the
Yeah,
setting off the idea of the
yeah,
city being
the
this
same thing.
miserable environment in the summer.
Yeah. So obviously that's something been going on for years and get them out and stuff. I can't imagine sending my family off for the summer. It's bad enough when they went out of town for a couple weeks to visit my wife's sister in Germany. Uh, and it was a combination of, miserable and, oh, I got some time myself, but it's miserable being alone.
And what do you do with yourself? You're so used to a routine and that includes them that suddenly you're like,
Yeah.
I've got all this free time. What do I do? What do I do?
Yeah, yeah. Well,
And
you work on more comic book reviews. You write
there
some
you go.
editorials. If I had a podcast at the time, I'd have written a couple podcasts. I probably wrote a couple songs. He goes,
Exactly. Now, if you're the characters in this story, more often than not, you're getting into some kind of trouble. You're
oh yeah,
playing
yeah,
cards with the boys every night, all night, or you're chasing down what in today's modern language I understand is referred to as your side piece or
oh
side action, which is
yeah,
suggested here for a couple of characters that you send off the family so that you can have your part-time, fun with somebody else who's
yep,
not your family, And also that there's these amazing layers involved, that there's so many stories being told, and yet so many of them have, as you mentioned, those wonderful recurring Will Eisner themes.
They all these characters have real change in them. What I found was interesting. I guess there's four main stories. I guess there's Goldie, there's Willie, there's Mr. Minx and his wife. Although they might not really change. They're just going through the same things. I think that's already happened to them. But then the wife and the husband, the Sam and his wife, the parents of Willie, they really have. He goes from being thinking he's got it made to he thinks he's got it made, but he's even entrenched even deeper because she's not going to give him a divorce. She's not going to do anything to let him uh, away from his responsibilities to her and the kids. I thought that was an interesting out of the frying pan into the fire kind of situation. Not that being married is like that, but just saying he thought he was going to get out of. He thought he was in a difficult situation having a mistress and being married, but now it's even worse because she knows, and he's never going to get anything he wants. He's only gonna he's not going. He's in there.
It's the price of trying to have your cake and eat it too. You know,
Yes,
he wants
yes,
both things,
exactly.
and she's saying, no, actually, this is how it's going to be. Not only do I know what's going on, and I've known what's going on, and I'm not going to give you what you want, which would give you the chance to sort of walk away from all your responsibilities and start a new life, because this one tires you, or you no longer, want any of the things with it. Um, it also reminds me of the street singer, because I had this great teacher, who reminded us, and it always stuck with me, who said, in great writing, one of the things that can be really enjoyable is a character who starts in a place and goes through a circle of experience where they have an opportunity to change, and then they
They
don't,
don't.
and they come right back to where they are, and you experience their, opportunities, and then they are who they are, and they're right back where they were again, and that's who they're always going to be. um, that one felt like it took us through that cycle for Sam and his wife. Yes, and also with the Minx couple, I feel like that's another example where they
Yeah,
sort of do this and this, but they come right back to who they are. They never stop
yeah,
being who they
yeah.
are. All that matters is what mattered before. But then for characters like Willie, yeah, for characters like Goldie, I can't remember the doctor character's name. It's totally escaping me at the moment.
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah,
Um, but
Benny.
oh wait, Herbie was the doctor character. Benny
Oh,
was
that
the
Benny's
not so
the.
nice kid.
That's right. That's right. Herbie.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And Herbie was one of those characters who I felt didn't change as much, stayed pretty much true to himself. But
Well, he's the other character in Goldie's story, really, and that
right.
the three characters in that story. Goldie is the main character in that mini story there, and I thought it was there it's all about Goldie seeing the what's really important in people. It's that moment where you go from being excited by the what's different and dangerous and that kind of thing, and then you find the person that's really a good person, and that's who you should be with, not the excitement. And because that's what she's going looking for, the excitement and that's what she thinks she has in Benny. But
Right.
it's the regular Herbie that's actually just a really good person that is best for, well, everybody really.
Well, and she's also, dealing with the same thing that Benny is that they're both living lies when they arrive on this
Yeah,
setting.
yeah.
And she understands, what that lie can cost her, and
Hmm.
what the consequences of that can be. Benny doesn't learn from his experience. He's just going to keep on doing what he's doing until things work out the way he hopes they will. And it's Herbie who I think really sort of like understands that, man, you can lie about who you are, or you can be true to yourself. And Herbie gets the reward because of that. He stays true to himself, and it's actually that truth that when he experiences Goldie suffering and he can give her that comfort, that she looks at him and realizes, if I want to go through life, do I want to go through it living a lie and experiencing this sort of heartache from other people who are doing the same thing I am and lying? Or do I want someone who's exactly who they say they are, exactly what they say they're going to do, and then does it over and over again? Like there's something consistent about Herbie because he is who he is. He's not trying to be anything else. And
Right.
why that's so valuable, why his authenticity is what makes him so important as the right choice for Goldie.
As we're talking about it, it's like from a Hirsch in a contrast with God, if he had never changed, he continues to
Hmm.
do the right thing. It's the flip side
Yes.
of that. It's no matter what has happened to Herbie, we don't know, but it's the flip side of that, just continuing to do the right thing.
Right.
And
And his belief in that,
yeah,
clearly he has a sense of let's call it faith in
yeah,
what he's doing and why he's doing it. It's because he believes it's the right thing to do.
mm,
He believes it's
mm,
how he should act and
mm.
what he should do in regards to his fellow man or fellow
And
person.
he's not judging her either. He doesn't judge her
No,
for what she does, you know, or what she did that led her into that bad situation.
right.
He
He's not judging her for any mistakes she made.
yeah,
He's accepting her for who she is. And in doing so, he's making it so clear for her that all she has to do is accept Herbie for who he is. And she's
yeah,
going to have a great person in her life. Like if she
yeah,
can look past what she thought were his limitations. Oh, you're
yeah,
just a band player. Oh, you're
yeah,
just, what she hasn't even discovered yet is this is a doctor in training who's
yeah,
got a great career ahead of him, who's
yeah,
got so many things lined up for him, and it's all the product of what he's been doing consistently, not trying to be somebody else, just be Herbie. Um, what I loved about that by comparison too is that you know there's a real challenge in the story of Willie, from what he experiences to what he witnesses to then how that shapes the person we see in that final panel. And while that's changed him, I also feel like it's shown Willie, to an extent, that there are things in the world that he's going to experience, and they're not all going to be things that are there to help him. And
yeah,
they might actually be things that are taking advantage of him. And in some ways, knowing what he wants to be involved in, what choices he's going to make, and the consequences he's going to face at 15, looked at as a man, uh, by the end being called the man of the house by his mother because dad's going to be
yeah,
traveling, and
yeah.
he's going to have to take on more
Traveling.
response. Right. And this whole idea that's suggested where Willie is sort of getting that sense of how the world really works, and he's on that landing, that fire escape, considering all that he's experienced, all that he's about to experience, and also, it appears making some decisions about. So, what does this all mean? And how do I come to terms with everything I've experienced and everything going on around me?
What I wrote down for that bit with Willie was that he's had a true loss of innocence in every way in this story.
Mm,
Everything he believed probably about his life and the world around him this week or 2 week or whatever it is, however long he's away, it totally changes everything.
mm,
He hears his parents, he knows his parents are something's going on with them. Uh, he's essentially taken advantage of by an older woman. Hey, it's titillating and exciting, oh my gosh, but then he sees the reality of that is that it's nothing to do with him.
mhm.
He's not She's not into him, it's not about him. She and her husband are are I guess the way it came out to me was they're like turned on by the infidelity
Hmm.
because
It's part of a
after
cycle with them, right? Like
yeah,
again,
yeah, yeah, it's like because after she takes advantage of Willie and he catches them, they're turned on and they have sex right there in front of him.
right?
And
And
it's
he
like, oh,
witnesses a shocking thing, especially after
yeah,
the man,
yeah,
physically assaults the woman. It's
yeah,
off panel, but you're
yeah,
aware of the fact that threats are made, and in
mm,
the suggestion of physical violence followed
Yeah.
by foreplay and then all out intercourse right
Yeah.
in front of the boy she just seduced, took advantage
Yeah.
of, and now has shown so little regard for, as they both do.
Yeah.
Which really struck me, because if you go through that, like how would, I mean, I would imagine afterwards I would see the world as this thing that happens in spite of me, that has very
Yeah.
little regard for who I am or what I care about, let alone the fact that I'm a human being existing in the space that they are. Because in that moment, he's not. He's no more important to them than the barn, than the straw, than the
Yeah.
loft. You know, he's as much an inanimate object as anything else around.
And what does he learn about sex from that experience?
Or
That
relationships.
yeah, yeah. I mean, what does that? I mean, Eisner draws a great panel of him sitting there with the blanket pulled up. And all you can see are like his eyes over the blanket. That kid is terrified. He
Yeah.
is terrified as that's happening in front of him. It just, to me, it just completely, I would imagine, destroys the notion of the beauty of, people that love each other, engaged in a relationship. And it just totally turns it on its head to where it's scary and terrifying, and it's not at all what he thought it was going to be like 5 minutes ago when it was him and the woman, he was probably like and now you know it's completely switched on him. I feel like that last panel when he's looking out, there's just so much weight on his shoulders. I feel like that image is just him realizing everything's changed, and he's just trying to figure out, I think you said it, his place now, his place in the world now. What, you're the man of the house. There's all this other stuff going on. But what about, emotionally inside, nobody knows what's happened with him. His
Mhm.
mom, his dad, none of the other characters, none of his family know. So he's all alone too. Now he's all alone. He's outside by himself, which is and everything else is going on inside, which is a nice visual uh, uh, depiction of the separation of him being all by himself now
Mm.
in the world outside, as opposed to inside with the family and part of a safe, loving environment, which he thought he had at the
Right.
beginning of the story. And now it's just, yeah. Isn't it amazing that all this stuff is in this story? This is not a long story. This is not like a 50-page story or anything. This is not a really long story,
No, this isn't
but
War and Peace.
this is amazing how much stuff Eisner can put in and be so effective with it. I
Yeah.
mean, even how many pages is Goldie's story if we just saw Goldie?
Right.
6 or 7 pages probably total. If it was
At
just
most.
her story, 8 maybe. But there's so much in there, and all together, you put them all together, and that's one of those really stunning things about Eisner's ability as a storyteller. Um, and he was great with the spirit and being able to tell these fantastic stories in 7 or 8 pages. But even in a longer form here, he's not satisfied with one story. He's got like 4 going on that are all told, perfectly. I mean,
It's a lot to take in.
it
We've been
is.
at
It
this
is.
for a while talking about. I think the one thing that struck me the most, that would be my final thought on Willie, is he's yet another example of a character who has gone through something where everything it's like we were talking about, and I'm going to take this all the way back to the beginning,
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
what you were like as a comic book reader before and
Okay.
after discovering Will Eisner. And for each one of the characters in this story, they experience something that then defines their lives as before and after that moment, and how after that moment they can never go back, to the way things were before.
No, you
After
can't.
each one of these characters experiences something that they've experienced, shown to us in these stories, they are, as you mentioned, changed. Some not, completely. Some are the constants that are always going, that always exist. But the stories that we experience of the characters we care about, and that's the important part. One, he makes us care about these characters, and then
Yeah.
afterwards, he shows us how something changes what they were into who they are. And like all of us, once that change occurs, it's irreparable. You can never go back. So
Mm-mm.
the story of Willie and that final panel is the story of a boy whose association with sex, with love and relationships will forever be altered by the moment he experienced at 15, on the cusp of manhood, at the height of his like sexual curiosity, excitement, and wonder. All of that in that moment irreparably altered by what he experiences, what he sees, and what he learns. The same thing happens to Hope. You know, there's what she thinks up until the moment she meets Benny and has, is assaulted by him. And then everything afterwards, you know, what she thought she was going for, what she thought she cared about, what she thought was important
Yeah.
is forever altered by Annie and then realigned through Herbie. The street singer who goes through this whole cycle of thinking he's going to do all these things only to learn that he's the villain of his own story, as I've heard Tony make the reference a couple of times about. I always love that reference. I
Yeah.
asked him once about the comics, what is it, Scott Pilgrim versus the World, and he's like, "Oh, he's just the villain in his own story. Man. You gotta check it out." And then also, you know, when it comes to the Super, and also with the original Contract with God, you know, with the Super, it's someone who has all of these things, has an understanding of the world up until that moment, and then suddenly the loss of his dog, the betrayal by a child, and his subsequent, you know, change in life is equally heartbreaking when you compare it to the one that we start out with Frim Hirsch,
Yeah.
who who up until this period had a contract that had worked, and then when it no longer works, he can't go back ever after that once he throws that thing out. And I really like that sense of giving us that understanding, because we can all reflect on moments. And like I said, my example that I can always go back to, 17 years old, and everything before I hurt my knee, and then everything about after I did, that's like a turning point in my life that I can
Mm.
always, you know, point to, a paradigm shift, as we were talking about before.
Yeah.
And how through this he is showing us the things we already know, but he's showing us through new characters and experiences that make it feel fresh, and also dig into those parts of ourselves that, let's be honest, if I experienced what Willie experienced at 15, I would not want to go back to that memory very often.
Yeah.
But on occasion, if I came across a story like this that reminded me of things that I chose to forget and reminded me about how important it was, or how it is that we don't like to dwell in these areas, but how formative they are to who we were and who we eventually become. He's showing us these things about ourselves that, as you mentioned in the beginning, are the quiet moments that we sometimes miss, just as equally as the monumental moments that we so often base our kind of framework as to who we are, who we were, and what we are capable of moving
Yeah.
forward. Um, Pretty amazing journey in such a short
Yeah.
book, you know, pretty amazing black and white journey, you know, and here we are some 40, 50 years later after its creation, talking about the impact it continues to have,
I got
and
a
how it's
feeling
still.
that if you give this book to somebody that doesn't know a lot about comics, that they would just be stunned. And then you tell them, "Oh yeah, not only that, it's almost 45 years old too." This is written in 1978. This is not new. This is
Right.
not contemporary. This is old.
There's a reason why it's called a seminal work, and one that's
Yeah,
existed in
yeah,
comics history for
yeah.
decades. There's a reason. Man, that has been, for me, so many great things to talk about. But I wanted to know if there was potentially anything we didn't address regarding Will Eisner, Contract with God, the Spirit, or anything else like that that, you know, you had thought of or would like to include, because those were all the points that, as we were going through, I was like, okay, I want to hit these points along the way, and make a point of addressing them. And I feel like I covered most of them, despite my attempt to just gloss over the Super, which you saved us from. And greatly thank you for. But I also just keep in mind that, you know, you came into this conversation with some expectations as well. And if there was anything you wanted to bring up as well, I just wanted to make sure.
I was
Yeah.
looking at my notes to see if there's anything. I think the one thing I will mention, we touched on it somewhat, but how with this book, Eisner is not adhering to any sort of standard comic book format. We talked a little bit about that, but just the way the whole thing starts, it's completely different. He shifts from like almost book illustration at one point. The whole page is the panel to where it suddenly shifts to, more standard panels, and then he has other pages where the entire page, like the very last page, the entire page is illustrated. There's no framing at all, and there's no illustration or narration. It's just the like a regular panel is just huge, and he uses those variations in his choice of panels or pages, whatever you want to call it, to pace the story and tell it in a different way than what you're used to seeing in comics. And we talked just a little bit about that, but I just wanted to bring that up because that was one of the things that, reading it again struck me, was how different it really is, especially when you first start at the beginning, and it sets you up sort of like a story. That is my phone ringing in case you hear that.
That's okay.
The like illustration where it's setting the stage for what he's gonna do next, and then once you get to a contract with God, it slowly changes from these full page uh, full pages, which could be, you could imagine these shrunk down with a small caption, and each of them could be a panel on a page, but instead he uses the full page format as a way of moving you through the story in a different way. And I just the variation just is really, he's freed from any sort of form constraints that one might expect to have in a comic. He's doing his own thing, and I'm sure there are others that have done similar things, but I don't know that it all comes together quite in the same way that he does it. You know what I mean? I mean, like even here, the whole background is the black,
Right.
um, which is, so it sets the tone and the mood so differently than you would on the next page when it's all white backgrounds.
Right.
It's just that storytelling variation. I could go on for hours about his technical achievements in comics, but just real quickly, and mine is actually in brown and white. I don't know if you can tell that on the pictures. It's not actually
No.
brown. It's
Interesting.
brown. It's brown, and it's not really a white page. It's a almost like a manila folder covered.
Interesting.
And if
Okay.
I remember correctly, and don't know if it's on the back of the book or not. Let's see. If I remember correctly, I feel like that's how it was originally published. And
Okay.
this is when they did this version in '85, they reproduced it that way as opposed to black and white. That could be wrong, but I am remembering something that happened that feel like I read 35 years ago. So I could be wrong about that, but
Okay.
but that stuck with me because it's the only book of his that's like that, and with brown ink and the manila paper as opposed to a standard black and white, which everything else of his, it's in black and white that I have.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, I'm curious now to see if I can find an old copy and compare that with. I think what I really enjoy what you were describing with the way he uses layout for every page. It's almost like in the process of telling this story, he's saying, let me show you everything I've learned. And let me show you page by page how you tell a story based on what the story is telling and the technique that you should use to tell that story in the best way possible. Like, I am a master at my craft. Let me show you not only everything I've learned, but how you use that every instance of telling a story so that you bring out the best of the story, so that you make that part of the story important for all the reasons, whether it's to set a tone with that black background that you were describing, where you feel like everything else is highlighted or with lamps, to when you exclude that and choose to show a similar shot of that same scene, but without that same sort of uh, heaviness that you've created, and how you start out with almost like a movie style of like a big wide camera shot on those first couple pages,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then he's like, okay, so now
Narrowing
I've
it
shown
down.
you,
He's narrowing down
right,
the focus. Yeah.
right, now we zoom in and now we get in, and all of those elements I feel are him saying, this is what I've learned. Let me show you how it works when I use it in the story I'm telling. And please note, in every instance I'm using it on every page, the purpose of the technique is to tell the story the best way possible. It's like when you watch one of those masters at a craft, like you were describing actually with the inkers, how they're starting at
Yeah.
that point,
Yeah.
and you're
Yeah.
like, the hell is that dot? The
Yeah.
hell is that dot?
Yeah.
And then they start to show you, like, okay, you didn't see what I was doing. And there's a reason, because I'm seeing it. And this is how I'm seeing it. And this is why I'm showing it to you in this way. Um, it definitely felt, as I went through page by page, and as you were describing it, I was reminded of this, of someone who is a master at what they do, saying, this is how you do it. You know, it's almost like an instruction manual. It's almost like this is how you create comics, depending on what you're doing and why you're doing it. The panel should dictate it, the color or the shading, the technique, everything about what I'm doing has a purpose. And in each page, there is proof of that execution, that reason behind the justification for why I did it this way. Because when you analyze it, you go, yep, okay. And you flip it again and you go, yep, for what he wants to do and what he's trying to tell us and show us, that's the exact way you should be doing it. Because once you've seen it that way, you realize there is no better way to do it. That's the right way to do it for the story he's trying to tell. I think that kind of excellence is one of those things. I was going to mention it earlier because there was something you were saying about his excellence, and I'm reminded of it. And it's that story I always hear about. I believe it was either Leonardo or Michelangelo. And you know how those greats were always being commissioned
Yeah.
by religious leaders to perform a work.
Yeah.
And at one point, when he was being suggested for a commission, they came, I believe it was Michelangelo. I'm not sure, but it was to one of those classic artists. They came to him and they were like, so how good are you? How is it you believe you can do this? So he turns around and he puts down a piece of paper, draws a perfect circle, and then looks at them like, this is what I do. You know what I mean? If you want to see just how good I am, here's a perfect circle drawn freehand. So what else would you like to talk about? You know what I mean? Like, that's what I feel he's doing with these pages, is he's going, there, it's perfect. I know it's perfect. You know it's perfect. There's nothing else to say. Turn the page. You know what I mean? Which is a great old Bob Seger reference that makes me smile. But yeah, just turn the page, man. Matt, this has been a hell of a conversation.
It has.
I've
I told you I had
2.5
3 hours.
of your time, and I'm using
That's
a
okay.
great deal of it.
That's okay.
I'd love to invite you back for when this goes live, because during Will Eisner Week, I'm going to see if I can get you and maybe some others from DC Comics News to join me for a couple of live things about Will Eisner. But I love that for anyone who wants to participate, I'll have this available for them to listen to so they can get an idea of what we've talked about, see what else this can kind of foment regarding conversation topics. Who knows what we might unlock for others who are listening and going, but I have so much more to add on that. We should talk. So I'm looking forward to others who might want to follow up with us, because we've unpacked so much, not only about Will Eisner, but about this work, about our own understanding of it as comic fans, as comic readers, through our own personal histories. And I also know we've barely scratched the surface. As you said, we could talk for more hours about this easily, right?
Well, easily. One of the things that struck me was I probably need to go back and reread a lot of the other stuff of his. And one of the things is I got into Eisner so when I was still a teenager. So I was reading that stuff as a kid. I mean, like I said, I was still a kid, and I'm reading that stuff then, and I'm, what have I missed? what did I not see then that I will go back and see now, with the hindsight of being, you know,
Well,
a
don't be
lot older.
shy about what you're reading. Let me know. Let anyone who might want to follow you and keep up with your reading. So maybe we can have a follow up conversation about this. Invite others to join and maybe direct them and all of us to another work of his that we can consider. Since we're kind of nearing the end, I just want to give the opportunity to let people know that you're out there in the world. They can find you should
I
they
am.
want to continue this conversation. We
Yeah.
mentioned your podcast, which I'd like to give another reference to again. You're with Comics in Motion, and
Yep.
go ahead and just
Classic Comics with Matthew B. Lloyd. It comes out every other Monday on the
every other.
Comics in Motion Network. Yeah, I flip flop with the Superheroes for Dummies show on Mondays.
Right, that's hosted by our own Mr. Steve J. Ray.
Yep.
And where else? If folks wanted to find you, it sounds like you might, wade into the waters of the Twitterverse and
Yeah.
the dangers lurking there.
Yeah. My Twitter handle is at Matthew B underscore Lloyd. I'm sorry, Matt B underscore Lloyd.
Gotcha.
I had to use Matt B. I couldn't. Matthew wouldn't go for whatever reason. I don't know why, but it's at
Somebody else
Matt
had
B
it.
underscore Lloyd. Yeah, something like that. Yeah,
Another
exactly. So
Matthew
that's
B was out there.
yeah. Arrgh, that's me. Yeah. So that's the best place to find me there. And if you're in Greensboro, North Carolina, you can find me at the Cracker Barrel in Wendover, and you can pull me over to the table and distract me from my job for a long time.
Matt, don't worry about those tables. Let's talk comics and spirit and
Exactly.
Eisner and hey, did you ever see this one from 1943? And go from there.
I've gotten distracted for people with music sometimes. Somebody had a T-shirt on one time, and I said, "I actually know who that band is," and they're like, "What?" And I was like, "Yeah." And so we talked for too long. The food came out. His wife was smiling, but I knew secretly inside she was like, "Can you please leave so we can eat?"
Right. You don't want this showing up in your Yelp review. I will complain that he spent too much time talking to my husband about music and bands. You also write reviews for DC Comics News. Is there
Oh
anywhere else
yes,
out there that
yeah,
folks
yeah.
can find you?
Regularly, I did a chapter with a friend in a book about Batman,
Oh,
uh,
please. Yes. I
pol-
love
pol-
this.
politics in Gotham, the Batman universe, and political thought. It is available on Amazon, and it's in a paperback form now, so it's cheaper than the original hardback, which was insanely expensive, and cost prohibitive for even the contributors to buy.
Oof.
But you can find that. And my friend and I've also have a chapter in a book about Black Panther coming out at some point, but there's been some delay, especially with the death of Chadwick Boseman, because they were going to try to sync it up with the release of the second movie. And
Black
now
Panther
that,
movie.
yeah, now that he's passed, there's some, changes coming for the movie. So I'm not quite sure when the book is coming out at this point, but
Okay.
so we're always looking to do stuff like that. So I'll post about that on Twitter if that anything
Please
else like that
do.
comes to fruition.
Yeah, but you've given folks a couple of places to find you, whether it's at DC Comics News, whether it's Classic Comics on Comics in Motion, whether it is out there in the world of Twitter. There's a couple of places that people have where they can find you, send you a message, follow up on our conversation, talk more classic comics with you, or talk about anything else that I guess might come up. But given what we've already unlocked, I'm sure they should know by now that you have a wealth of information available, and clearly you are more than willing and happy to share it, to which I am grateful, and which I want to say thank you, man, for coming on today and talking with me.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to have a space to talk about passions, because I'm sorry my kids don't want to hear me talk about Will Eisner for 2 hours at the dinner table.
Yeah, I'm
But
going to be honest. My wife's the same way.
but it's one of those things, the things you're passionate about, you want to talk about and share. That's one of the nice things, I guess, about social media is there are outlets now where you can get together with people and discuss the things you like, even if you don't always have people in your immediate family and friend group that have those exact same interests. And music's the same way. So if you're into music too, music is the other passion in my life. And if you listen to the Classic Comics podcast, you'll hear some music too. That is all the music I use on that show is me. So it's either something I've written or something I've covered. So
Oh, that's huge,
just,
man. Yeah.
it's me. So it's like the theme song is me. There's and anything, any music is me playing and singing and all that stuff. So it's an outlet. It's an outlet I have where I can do something with that. So that's a little bonus, but
that's huge,
fun
man.
too.
Yeah. Hey, thank you again for coming on with me, talking with me. I look forward to the chance to, talk with you more about comics. Who knows what else might be in store and what episode I'll get to have you back on. But man, thank you for being here and talking with me. It's been a great time.
I had a great time. Thank you, Seth, for asking. Yeah, anytime we can set something else up. I had a blast, and it was a great conversation. You really got me by asking me to do this book. You got me to re-examine something I hadn't examined in a long time, and then our conversation in the course of the conversation, you continue to get me to think about it in new and I felt insightful ways. So I'm appreciative of that as well.
My pleasure, my friend. With that, I'm going to stop our recording, allow us to finish whatever bits of conversation we will in our own privacy. And with that, hey, you've been listening to Storytelling with Seth. It's been my pleasure to have on with me Mr. Matthew B. Lloyd. Thank you, sir. And that brings us to the end of my great conversation with Matt B. Lloyd. I want to thank him once again for sitting down and sharing so many wonderful insights about A Contract with God and about what it was like for him to stumble across Will Eisner's works, what it meant to prove or convince or cajole parents that he was old enough to read the material and understand what it was talking about. But I also enjoyed the way he pointed out to me that there were so many things that he got from the book this time around that he didn't the first time, and also so much that he was able to share as such a ardent fan of classic comics. Again, I recommend, if you enjoyed hearing Matt's insights, check him out, where he is the host of Classic Comics on Comics in Motion. He also writes great reviews for DC Comics News, and who knows what else is in store. Oh yes, that's right, he did contribute to a book, Politics in Gotham, a really interesting insight to Batman, and I highly encourage, if you enjoy the intersection of political theory, politics, and comics, or simply comics with any other facet of life, it's a book you're going to want to check out. Of course, there's all the other ways that you can reach Matt, and a reminder that if you'd like to hear the audio version of this only while doing whatever it is you're doing, it originally aired on my podcast, Storytelling with Seth. So, no Bruno showed up for this one. Who knows if he'll be around for the intro or outro for upcoming episodes. If that's not good enough reason for you, please subscribe, rate, review, come back around. Maybe it's just me, maybe it's Bruno, but I plan to always have a great story to share with you. Until next time.